He never told anyone the whole truth. Not the chaplain who visited him in the VA hospital in 1974, not the grief counselor Sarah made him see after Carol died, and not the men in the veteran circle who shared their own broken pieces every Thursday night in that church basement. There were parts of Vietnam that John Mitchell kept locked in a place so deep inside himself that even he was afraid to go there alone. But the truth has a way of surfacing. It always does. It rises like heat off asphalt in July, slow and distorting everything you try to see clearly. John was born in 1953 in Millbrook, Ohio, a town so small it had one stoplight, and everyone knew your grandmother's maiden name. His father, Robert Mitchell, was a Korean War veteran who worked at the grain mill and spoke about service the way other men spoke about religion, with reverence, with duty, and without much room for questions. His mother, Eleanor, made pie on Sundays and ironed every shirt in the house with the kind of precision that suggested she believed order could protect her family from the chaos of the world outside. They were not wealthy. They were not unhappy. They were American in the way that generation understood it, quietly proud, deeply practical, and completely unprepared for what was coming. John enlisted on his 19th birthday. Not because he was drafted, though the draft would have found him soon enough. He enlisted because his father shook his hand at breakfast that morning and said, "A Mitchell man serves." Those 4 words were the compass of John's entire youth, and he followed them without hesitation, without research, without any real understanding of what Vietnam had already become by 1971. He had seen the news, of course. He had heard the protests on the radio. But he was 19, and certain of his own invincibility in the way only the very young can be, and so he signed his name on the paper and became a soldier. The flight to Vietnam took 22 hours. John spent most of it staring out the small oval window at darkness, listening to the low murmur of other young men pretending to sleep. There was a boy named Caruso sitting next to him, from somewhere in New Jersey, who talked too fast and laughed too loud in the way people do when they are genuinely terrified. He offered John a stick of juicy fruit gum and said, "My cousin did 2 tours and came back fine. We're gonna be fine." John took the gum and nodded and said nothing. He already sensed, in some place beneath thought, that fine was no longer on the table. The base camp was nothing like John had imagined. There was mud everywhere, a smell in the air that was equal parts rot and smoke and something chemical he could never fully identify, and a noise at all hours that kept your nervous system permanently switched on. The veterans there, men who had already been in country for months, moved differently than the new arrivals. They were quieter. Their eyes scanned constantly, not anxiously, just automatically, the way animals scan at a watering hole. John watched them and understood he was looking at what he would need to become if he wanted to survive. His unit operated in the Central Highlands, running patrols through dense jungle terrain that swallowed sound and visibility with equal indifference. The heat was physical, a presence that sat on your shoulders and squeezed. The rain, when it came with complete seriousness, turning the ground to soup and the air to warm gray gauze. John learned to function in discomfort so total it eventually became background noise. He learned to eat fast, sleep light, and trust the man beside him with a completeness he had never trusted another human being before. That man was Corporal Dennis Fay from Biloxi, Mississippi, 23 years old, with a wide, easy smile and a talent for remaining calm in situations that unwound every other man around him. Fay had been in Vietnam for 14 months when John arrived, which made him ancient by the unit's reckoning. He taught John how to read the jungle, how to listen for the particular silence that preceded an ambush, how to keep moving when your body was screaming at you to stop. He talked about his mother's cooking the way some men talk about religion, and on bad nights, when the darkness pressed in and the fear was a living thing crawling through the unit's collective chest, Fay would describe her red beans and rice in such precise and loving detail that men would actually calm down. John never forgot that. The power of an ordinary thing described with love. The ambush that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in March of 1972. John's patrol was moving through a valley when the tree line opened up. The sound was enormous and immediate. No warning, no building dread, just the sudden total violence of contact. Men scattered. John hit the ground behind a fallen log and began returning fire by instinct, his training working his body while his mind tried to catch up to what was happening. It lasted 11 minutes. Later someone told him that. 11 minutes. It felt like a season. Dennis Fay was hit in the first exchange. John crawled to him under fire, 20 feet of open ground that he crossed without deciding to, purely on the force of something that had no name. Fay was alive, but barely. He looked at John with those calm eyes and said, with genuine curiosity more than fear, "How bad is it?" John told him it wasn't bad. It was bad. Fay seemed to understand that John was lying, and he nodded slowly, the way a man accepts a kindness, even when he can see through it. He died before the medevac arrived. John held his hand until it went cold, and then he kept holding it because letting go felt like something he was not yet ready to do. He received a commendation for his actions that day. He put the paper in a shoebox and never looked at it again. He came home in 1973 to an America that had moved on. The war was ending badly, publicly, on the nightly news, and veterans were arriving back into a country that was exhausted by the subject and unsure how to look the men who'd served directly in the eye. John came home to Millbrook in November, thin and quiet, and wearing a face his mother didn't quite recognize. His father met him at the door, shook his hand again, and said simply, "Welcome back, son." That was the entirety of their debrief. John went up to his childhood bedroom, lay on the narrow mattress under the faded baseball pennants, and stared at the ceiling for 3 hours without moving. The years that followed were built on a structure of normalcy that John constructed deliberately and maintained through sheer discipline. He got a job at the county road department. He married Carol in 1977, a school teacher with dark eyes and a forthright gentleness that made people feel immediately trusted. They bought the farmhouse outside of town, the one with the wraparound porch and the old oak tree out front, and they built a life in it with the slow, careful intention of people who understood that good things required maintenance. Their daughter Sarah was born in 1980, a serious and perceptive child who seemed to arrive into the world already understanding that some things are not said out loud. John was a good father in the ways that counted. He showed up. He fixed things. He attended every school play and every soccer game, and he never once raised his hand in anger. But there was a door in him that stayed closed, and his family lived with that closed door. The way you learn to live with a draft in an old house. You adjust, you accommodate, you stop noticing it until the coldest days. The nightmares came every few months, irregular enough to seem manageable. He would wake at 3 in the morning with his heart pounding and the precise sensory memory of the jungle alive in his nervous system, the smell, the heat, the sound of that March Tuesday, and he would sit in the kitchen with the light over the stove on, because full darkness was not something he could do in those moments. Carol would appear after a while, without being called, and sit across from him with her own cup of tea, and they would sit together in the quiet until the worst of it passed. She never asked him to explain. She simply refused to let him be alone with it. That was its own form of love, steady and unspectacular and completely irreplaceable. When Carol was diagnosed in the spring of 2018, John experienced a fear that surpassed everything, surpassed the ambush, surpassed the cold grief of holding Dennis Fay's hand in that valley. Because this was Carol. This was the architecture of his daily life, the person who had made the farmhouse into a home and his silence into something bearable. The cancer moved quickly. By January of 2019, she was gone, and the farmhouse became a place John walked through rather than inhabited. The grief was total and disorganizing. He forgot to eat. He left the truck running in the driveway once for 4 hours without noticing. Sarah drove from Columbus every other weekend and found him diminished in ways that frightened her. Not dramatically, not dangerously, just quietly disappearing, like a photograph left in sunlight. She brought groceries he didn't cook. She washed dishes he hadn't dirtied. None. She sat beside him on the porch the way she had as a child, watching him look at nothing, except now she understood better what the nothing contained. It was Sarah who found the veterans group. She left the flyer on the kitchen table without comment, which was the right strategy with her father. No pressure, no persuasion, just information placed quietly in his path. John went the first Thursday in October of 2020, drove the 11 miles to town in the dark, sat in the church basement parking lot for 8 minutes before going in, and chose the chair closest to the door. He didn't speak that first night. He listened to men who carried recognizable weight talk about it with a plainness that surprised him. No drama, no performance, just honest accounting. A Marine named Gerald, 71 years old, with a white beard and eyes that had clearly seen the full range of what human beings are capable of, said the thing that got inside John's defenses. He said, "I spent 40 years thinking the guilt meant I didn't deserve to be here. Then one day I realized the guilt was just love with nowhere to go. It was love for the ones I couldn't bring back." John sat with that sentence for a week. He turned it over in his mind the way you work a splinter, carefully, patiently, from different angles. Love with nowhere to go. He thought about Dennis Fay and his calm eyes and his mother's red beans and rice. He thought about Tommy Reeves, who had been in his unit for 3 weeks and hummed country songs and was gone before John even learned his middle name. He thought about all the weight he had been carrying as guilt when maybe it was something else. Something he had never allowed himself to call by its real name. He went back to the group the following Thursday. He went back the Thursday after that. Somewhere around the 6th or 7th week, he spoke. Not much. He said his name, said where he served, said he had lost people and never properly grieved them because no one had given him the framework to understand that grief was the appropriate response, that it wasn't weakness, that it wasn't something to be outrun. The men in that room nodded with the recognition of people who had been waiting years for someone to say the exact thing they themselves had never found the words for. John Mitchell is 72 years old now. He tends a garden behind the farmhouse, tomatoes in the summer, sunflowers along the south fence, a small herb bed that Carol had always wanted and that he planted the spring after she died as a way of continuing a conversation he was not ready to end. His hands still shake slightly in heavy rain. He still wakes sometimes at 3 in the morning with the jungle loud in his chest. But he gets up now and sits at the kitchen table, and he says the names out loud into the quiet house. Dennis Fay, Tommy Reeves, the others. He says their names the way Gerald said grief was love with nowhere to go, and he gives it somewhere to go. Into the air of the house, into the dark, into whatever is listening. Last Christmas, Sarah sat beside him at the kitchen table after dinner, and John told her about Dennis Fay for the first time. He described the wide, easy smile and the red beans and rice and the 11 minutes in the valley and the hand he held until it went cold. Sarah cried without trying to hide it. John watched his daughter cry and felt something in his chest loosen, not break, not collapse, but loosen, like a knot worked patient and long, finally giving way. He put his hand over hers on the table. Outside the farmhouse windows, the Ohio winter was doing its serious and indifferent work. But inside, in the kitchen, with the light on over the stove and his daughter beside him, and the names of his dead spoken aloud into the warm air, John Mitchell was, in the only way that had ever been available to him, finally home. Some wars end with treaties and ceremonies and news coverage. Some wars end quietly, in church basements and kitchen tables and gardens planted for people who are gone. Some wars end when a man finally lets himself feel the full weight of what he carried and discovers that in the feeling of it, just the honest feeling of it, the weight becomes something he can bear. It took John 50 years, but he got there, and that in itself is a victory worth honoring.